The year is 1099. Dust and the scent of iron hang heavy in the air outside the ancient walls of Jerusalem. Inside, a desperate silence reigns, broken only by the distant clang of siege engines and the fervent prayers of a populace caught between worlds. For weeks, the city has been a crucible of fear, its defenders a fragile alliance of Muslim soldiers and Jewish citizens, united against a common, terrifying foe. They watch from the battlements as a sea of crosses glitters under the relentless sun, an army forged in the fires of a distant continent's faith, now at their very gates, promising salvation through conquest. The stakes are nothing less than the soul of a city holy to three great faiths. For the Fatimid defenders, it is the heart of their territory in the Levant. For the Jewish inhabitants, it is the biblical city of their ancestors, a place of profound spiritual significance. For the approaching army of the First Crusade, it is the ultimate prize, the earthly representation of their devotion, a city they believe must be wrested from the hands of infidels. The air crackles with a tension that transcends mere military conflict. It is a collision of beliefs, a war for the divine sanction of God Himself. At the heart of this maelstrom of faith and fury is a man whose name has been largely lost to the grand narratives of history, a Fatimid governor named Iftikhar al-Dawla. He is not a legendary sultan or a fabled warrior, but a professional soldier and administrator tasked with the impossible, defending a sprawling, ancient city against a fanatically motivated and battle-hardened European army. He has prepared, strengthening the walls, expelling some local Christians whose loyalties he doubted, and forging a pact with the city's Jewish community, who understood that their fate was tied to the city's defense. As the final, brutal assault begins, the question hangs heavier than the stones hurled by trebuchets. Can this man, Iftikhar al-Dawla, a figure of competent but unremarkable authority, hold back the tide of zealous fury that has crossed a continent to reclaim this holy ground? Can his pragmatic defense, a coalition of necessity between Muslim and Jew, withstand the sheer, overwhelming force of an army that believes God Himself has commanded their victory, promising paradise to those who fall in the shadow of Jerusalem's walls? The answer is written in the blood that soon flows through the city's cobbled streets. The Crusaders, through a combination of relentless assault and ingenious siege tactics, breached the formidable defenses. What follows is not a negotiated surrender but a horrific sack, a frenzy of violence that consumes soldier and civilian alike. Iftikhar al-Dawla and his remaining guard retreat to the Tower of David, negotiating a surrender that grants them safe passage, a lone island of order in a sea of chaos. The city, however, is lost, and the immediate aftermath is a brutal testament to the fervor that drove the conquerors. History is not merely a chronicle of kings and popes, but a tapestry woven from the threads of countless, often forgotten, moments of decision and consequence. The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 was not just a military victory. It was a cataclysm that reshaped the consciousness of both East and West, a moment when religious zeal hardened into a sword that would carve divisions into the world for centuries to come, all resting on the actions of men like Iftikhar al-Dawla, who stood in the path of a storm they could not possibly contain. The genesis of this storm can be traced back to a field in Clermont, France, in the year 1095. A voice powerful and persuasive echoes across a vast crowd of nobles, knights, and commoners. It speaks of distant lands, of a holy city desecrated, and of a righteous path to redemption paved with both peril and piety. This was not merely a sermon, it was a call to arms that would ignite a fire in the heart of Europe, a summons that promised the remission of all sins for those who undertook the journey. The speaker was Pope Urban II, a man of shrewd political intellect and profound religious authority. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of Christian suffering in the East, a narrative crafted to stir the souls and swords of his audience. He spoke of pilgrims harassed and holy sites defiled by the Seljuk Turks. This appeal was a masterstroke, tapping into a deep well of piety, a growing culture of pilgrimage, and the restless, violent energy of a knightly class often engaged in petty warfare amongst themselves. The Pope's words offered a radical new direction for this energy, a holy war. No longer would knights fight fellow Christians for land and honor. Now they could turn their martial skills to a higher purpose, fighting for Christ Himself. Enter upon the road to the Holy Sepulchre, he implored. Wrest that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves. It was a message that transformed violence from a sin into a sacred duty, a holy mission sanctioned by the highest spiritual authority on earth. This call resonated with a mysterious power across the disparate realms of Western Europe. It was not just the promise of spiritual salvation that moved men to take the cross. For landless younger sons, it was a chance at fortune and a fiefdom in a new world. For merchants, it was the prospect of new trade routes and immense profit. For the devout, it was an act of ultimate faith. And for many, it was the lure of an epic adventure into lands of legend and myth. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Cries of Deus vult, God wills it, thundered from the crowd, a spontaneous, unified roar that sealed the fate of a generation. This was not a carefully planned military campaign orchestrated by kings, but a popular movement, a torrent of humanity unleashed. Soon, massive, disorganized armies of peasants and knights alike would begin their long, arduous march eastward, driven by a complex web of motives, all shrouded in the righteous cloak of religious zeal. Before the main armies of the knights could even depart, a strange and tragic precursor to the main event unfolded. A man known as Peter the Hermit, a charismatic preacher of minor noble birth, gathered a massive, ill-equipped horde of commoners, a wave of fervor known as the People's Crusade. They were not soldiers but pilgrims with makeshift weapons, driven by an unshakable belief that their faith alone would conquer all obstacles. Their journey was marked by a dark, ominous shadow of violence, not against Muslims, but against the Jewish communities of the Rhineland. This wave of popular piety also gave rise to one of the most enigmatic and haunting episodes of the entire era, the so-called Children's Crusade. The story, shrouded in a blend of fact and folklore, tells of a French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes and a German boy, Nicholas of Cologne. They claimed divine visions, believing they could succeed where the armies of adults had failed, not through force, but through the purity of their innocent faith. Thousands of followers, many of them adolescents and the landless poor, were drawn to their charismatic preaching. They marched south, believing the Mediterranean Sea would part for them, as the Red Sea had for Moses. The sea, of course, did not part. The aftermath is a murky tale of tragedy, with accounts of the marchers being sold into slavery by treacherous merchants or dying from starvation and disease. Whether a literal army of children or a movement of the dispossessed, its memory speaks to the incredible, and sometimes dangerously naive, power of the faith that gripped the age. As the true armies of the First Crusade carved their path across Anatolia, they were not merely marching into enemy territory, they were stepping into a different world. The Islamic civilization they encountered was in many ways far more advanced than the Europe they had left behind. Cities like Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo were vibrant centers of learning, science, and art. Scholars there had preserved and built upon the classical knowledge of Greece and Rome, knowledge that had been largely lost in the West. The Crusaders, despite their military purpose, became conduits for a slow, almost unconscious cultural exchange. They encountered new foods, spices, and textiles that would eventually transform European tastes and economies. They saw architectural marvels and irrigation techniques far beyond what they knew. Knowledge of medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, preserved and advanced in the Arab world, began to trickle back to Europe, carried in the minds of returning crusaders and in the translations of texts that would eventually fuel the Renaissance. The establishment of the Crusader states, or Outremer, the land beyond the sea, created bizarre pockets of cultural fusion. Frankish lords ruled over a diverse populace of local Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Over time, some European settlers adopted local customs, clothing, and even food, creating a unique hybrid culture. Alliances were sometimes forged between Christian and Muslim rulers against common enemies, revealing that the stark lines of religious conflict could be blurred by the practical necessities of politics and survival. Yet this exchange was always shadowed by the violence of the conflict. The Crusaders also brought back new military technologies and tactics learned from their adversaries. The design of European castles evolved, incorporating elements of Byzantine and Islamic fortifications to create the concentric castles that would dominate the later medieval landscape. The constant warfare honed military strategies and led to the formation of new, powerful institutions dedicated to the Holy War. Perhaps the most mysterious and enduring of these institutions were the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, better known as the Knights Templar. Founded around 1119, their initial purpose was humble: to protect Christian pilgrims on the dangerous roads to Jerusalem. They were a new kind of creation, the warrior monk bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet also a highly trained and disciplined soldier. From these modest beginnings, the Templars grew into one of the most powerful organizations in the medieval world. Endowed with papal blessings and donations of land and wealth from across Europe, they became a formidable military force in the Crusader states. But their true innovation lay elsewhere. By developing a sophisticated system of letters of credit, they essentially created the first international banking system, allowing pilgrims and nobles to deposit assets in Europe and withdraw them safely in the Holy Land. This financial acumen made them fabulously wealthy and influential, financing kings and popes alike. Their power, combined with the secrecy of their initiation rites and internal operations, fueled suspicion and envy. Whispers and rumors began to circulate about their vast hidden treasures, their supposed heretical practices, and secret knowledge unearthed from beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. These mysteries would ultimately sow the seeds of their spectacular downfall. The fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187 sent shockwaves through Christendom and triggered the Third Crusade, a conflict that pitted two of history's most legendary figures against each other: Richard I of England, the Lionheart, and the Kurdish Sultan, Saladin. Saladin was a figure of immense charisma and military genius, who had succeeded in uniting the fractured Muslim states of Syria and Egypt under his rule. His recapture of Jerusalem was marked not by a massacre, but by a negotiated surrender that allowed many citizens to ransom their freedom, a stark contrast to the Crusader conquest 88 years prior. Richard the Lionheart was the archetypal crusading king, a brilliant tactician and a fearsome warrior, but also a tempestuous and often ruthless leader. The war between these two men was one of hard-fought battles and grudging respect. At the Battle of Arsuf, Richard's disciplined army won a crucial victory, but he was ultimately unable to retake Jerusalem. The campaign ended not in a climactic final battle, but in a truce, the Treaty of Jaffa, which left Jerusalem under Muslim control but guaranteed safe passage for unarmed Christian pilgrims. The clash between Richard and Saladin became the stuff of legend, romanticized in the chronicles of both cultures. It represented a strange chivalry that could exist even amidst the brutality of holy war. Yet the failure to reclaim the Holy City left a lingering sense of unfinished business in Europe, an obsession that would lead to one of the most bizarre and tragic diversions in the entire history of the Crusades. In 1202, the call for a Fourth Crusade was answered. The plan was ambitious: to strike at the heart of Saladin's former empire, Egypt, and then use it as a base to recapture Jerusalem. However, the crusade was plagued by problems from the start, primarily a lack of funds. The Crusaders had contracted the powerful maritime Republic of Venice to build a massive fleet to transport them, but far fewer knights arrived than anticipated, and they could not pay the agreed-upon price. The cunning and elderly Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, proposed a deal. He would defer the debt if the Crusaders would help Venice recapture the rebellious Christian city of Zara on the Adriatic coast. Despite papal prohibitions against attacking fellow Christians, the Crusaders, desperate and trapped, agreed. This first diversion was a dark omen, a sign that the expedition's spiritual goals were becoming entangled with and corrupted by worldly politics and greed. The final, fatal diversion came with the arrival of Alexios Angelos, a young Byzantine prince seeking to usurp the imperial throne in Constantinople. He promised the Crusaders immense wealth, military aid, and the reunification of the Orthodox and Catholic churches if they would help him overthrow his uncle. Lured by the prospect of solving their financial woes and the ancient ambition of bringing the Eastern Church to heel, the Crusader leaders agreed to divert their campaign to the greatest Christian city in the world. The siege and subsequent sack of Constantinople in 1204 was an act of shocking brutality that forever poisoned relations between the eastern and western branches of Christianity. For 3 days, the crusading army, which had set out to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslims, plundered the riches of their fellow Christians. Priceless works of art were destroyed or melted down, churches were desecrated, and thousands of civilians were killed. The Byzantine Empire was shattered, leaving a weak Latin kingdom in its place, and fatally weakening the ancient Christian bulwark against eastward expansion. The Fourth Crusade never reached the Holy Land. The 2 centuries of conflict left an indelible and complex legacy on the world, one that still echoes in the modern age. The memory of the Crusades has been invoked and reshaped over the centuries to serve different political and ideological purposes. For some in the West, it became a romanticized tale of chivalry and adventure. In the Islamic world, it was remembered as a brutal, unprovoked invasion, a forerunner to later European colonialism, leaving a deep-seated legacy of mistrust. Economically, the Crusades helped to stimulate trade and accelerate the rise of Italian maritime cities like Venice and Genoa, which grew rich transporting crusaders and goods. This increased interaction with the East helped to slowly reawaken Europe from its so-called Dark Ages, contributing to the intellectual and cultural ferment that would lead to the Renaissance. The movement of people and ideas, however violent its context, undeniably broadened Europe's horizons. Politically, the Crusades enhanced the power of both the papacy, which demonstrated its ability to direct the military might of Europe, and the monarchies, which grew stronger as many powerful nobles died or impoverished themselves in the East. The creation of military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers established powerful transnational corporations with immense wealth and influence. The legacy of crusading also influenced European expansion for centuries, providing a religious justification for later conquests. The story of the Crusades is a cautionary tale about the potent, often dangerous, fusion of faith and violence. It reveals how calls for religious purity and divine will can become entangled with greed, political ambition, and cultural prejudice. The clashing of these civilizations was not just a story of battles and sieges, but also of unintended consequences, of slow cultural transmission, and of the creation of historical grievances that have been weaponized in the rhetoric of conflict even to this day. We end where we began, outside the walls of a holy city, but this time the walls are not of stone but of memory. The Crusades were more than a series of medieval wars. They were a turning point in the relationship between two great civilizations. They created a shared history of conflict that hardened identities and drew lines in the sand, both literally and figuratively. The echoes of Deus Vult and the call to jihad can still be heard, faint but persistent, in the fraught dialogues of our contemporary world. This epic struggle, born from a sermon in a French field, shows how a single, powerful idea can move armies across the known world, topple empires, and forge a legacy of both magnificent achievement and profound tragedy. It is a stark reminder that the quest for heaven on earth can sometimes create a living hell, and that the clash of civilizations is often at its heart a clash of competing certainties, each believing itself to be sanctioned by the divine. History is shaped not only by the victors, but by the ghosts of the vanquished and the lingering power of the stories we tell about them.